So, have you ever noticed that when there's a popular post online on, social media or something like that, you'll see certain kinds of comments in response, and there's certain kind of tropes that people are getting from somewhere and then sharing, and where's all this stuff coming from? Who knows? Well, I think we can guess where it's coming from. But yeah, so I thought I would put together what I think, off the top of my head, are the top five most ridiculous arguments against electric cars, because these are one of these kind of weirdly politicized kind of things where there's all this kind of misinformation going on out there, and people get very worked up about the switch from combustion cars towards electric cars that's going on at the moment. So, what are the most ridiculous arguments that are out there? And so I'll go through them in kind of top five style, and then I'll mention some of the better arguments as well along the way. But yeah, number five that I've put in is they're too expensive. And this is the Renault 5, and I tried to capture five of them here off the Renault website. Yeah, REVs too expensive. And I guess if you're going to say too expensive, you have to then say, well, expensive compared to what? Right? Because that's always the question that's overlooked with a lot of these things. So really, I suppose what we're thinking about is an equivalent car. So you could buy an electric car or you could buy a fossil fuel car. And then another question is, over what time period are you comparing these purchases? So is it just the cost up front? Because in the early days, EVs were a lot more expensive, right? You look at Nissan Leaf 15 years ago, that came out, and wow, that was very expensive for a car. And, it didn't have, very good battery range or anything like that. But you pay maybe twice as much as you'd pay for an equivalent kind of car. But fortunately, for all of us, battery prices have just dropped massively. They dropped enough that you could start to put them in cars 15, 20 years ago. Now they've dropped to the point where battery car is not too much more expensive than a traditional combustion car. Battery prices keep on dropping, then soon, it's going to be a no-brainer. They'll be much cheaper. And then there's the question of lifetime cost as well. And already for lifetime cost, it's much cheaper to have an EV, particularly if you can charge it at home using your own electricity. Then it's extremely cheap to run the vehicle. They don't have an engine that's constantly trying to destroy itself, combusting away all the time. So yeah, over the course of the whole life of the vehicle, it will be cheaper. And actually, at the moment, I think that in terms of that equivalent car, the EV secondhand are very good value. So I'd say that if you're looking at a secondhand car at the moment in the UK at least, EVs are actually the cheaper option. They're cheaper to buy really in terms of the equivalent, and they're much cheaper to run, particularly if you can charge it at home.
So
So
my
my
number
number
four
four
most
most
ridiculous
ridiculous
topic,
topic,
and
and
I
I
struggle
struggle
to
to
order
order
these.
these.
I
I
keep
keep
switching
switching
them
them
around.
around.
Is
Is
the
the
claim
claim
that
that
it's
it's
worse
worse
for
for
the
the
environment.
environment. And on the one hand, this is really ridiculous argument, but there's a way in which it's not ridiculous. So that's why I ended up putting it to number four, whereas it was number two originally. So
Again,
again,
the
the
big
big
question
question
is
is
compared
compared
to
to
what?
what?
Just
Just
like
like
with
with
the
the
last
last
one.
one.
What
What
is
is
it
it
worse
worse
for
for
the
the
environment
environment
in
in
comparison
comparison
to?
to?
For the
For the
last
last
one,
one,
I
I
was
was
saying,
saying,
well,
well,
really,
really,
we're
we're
comparing
comparing
to
to
the
the
equivalent
equivalent
combustion
combustion
car.
car.
That's
That's
your
your
usual
usual
comparison that
comparison
you
that you
would
would
think.
think.
I
I
guess
guess
that's
that's
what
what
people
people
are
are
imagining,
imagining,
and
and
then
then
they're
they're
just
just
completely
completely
way
way
off.
off.
But
But
then,
then,
in a
in a
way,
way,
though,
though,
what
what
if
if
your
your
comparison
comparison
is
is
to
to
just
just
having
having
no
no
car
car
at
at
all?
all?
So,
So,
if
if
your
your
comparison
comparison
is
is
to
to
having a
having a
bike,
bike,
then
then
yeah,
yeah,
a
a
bike
bike
is
is
just
just
much,
much,
much
much
better
better
for
for
the
the
environment
environment
than
than
a
a
one
one
and
and
a
a
half
half
or
or
two
two
ton
ton
vehicle,
vehicle,
right?
right?
So
So
that's
that's
absolutely a
absolutely a
no-brainer.
no-brainer.
Having
Having
no
no
car
car
at
at
all
all
is
is
better
better
for
for
the
the
environment.
environment.
So
So
yeah,
yeah,
I'll
I'll
come
come
back
back
to
to
that
that
later.
later.
But
But
compared to
compared to
the
the
ICE
ICE
car,
car,
there's
there's
just
just
no
no
contest
contest
at
at
all,
all,
really.
really.
People
People
are
are
desperately
desperately
clutching
clutching
at
at
straws
straws
on
on
this
this
one.
one,
But
but
mostly
mostly
they're
they're
the
the
same,
same,
right?
right?
They've
They've
got
got
wheels,
wheels,
they've
they've
got
got
doors,
doors,
they've
they've
got a
got a
roof.
roof.
All
All
these
these
kinds
kinds
of
of
things
things
that
that
cars
cars
have,
have,
they're
they're
the
the
same.
same.
The
The
difference
difference
is
is
just
just
that
that
ICE
ICE
car
car
has
has
a
a
fuel
fuel
tank
tank
and
and
an
an
engine
engine
and,
and,
transfers
transfers
fuels
fuels
around
around
within
within
it.
it.
And
And
the
the
EV
EV
has
has
a
a
motor
motor
and
and
a
a
battery.
battery.
That's the
That's the
difference.
difference.
So
So
then
then
what
what
kind
kind
of
of
environmental
environmental
harms
harms
are
are
we
we
thinking
thinking
about
about
here?
here?
What's
What's
the
the
pollution
pollution
that
that
we're
we're
thinking
thinking
about?
about?
If
If
we're
we're
thinking
thinking
about
about
local
local
air
air
pollution,
pollution,
then
then
obviously
obviously
the
the
battery
battery
vehicle
vehicle
doesn't
doesn't
have
have
a
exhaust pipe. It's not producing any clean exhaust. So there's no contribution to local air pollution through burning anything like there is with the combustion car. So that one is a clear win for the battery car. And then when we think about climate change, again, there's just no comparison really in terms of the pollution created by a car that's always burning fuel and creating CO2. So that one is very straightforward. EVs are just much more efficient. Most of the fuel that goes into the combustion car actually just gets lost in heat and noise and vibration and that sort of thing. So an EV, because it has regenerative braking as well, when you're going downhill, it can put some back in the battery or when you're coming to a stop, traffic light or something like that. So when you add that in, it's about 90% efficient in terms of the efficiency of the vehicle, whereas a combustion car, they're desperately trying to increase the efficiency more and more and more, making it more complicated, making it more expensive, making it last much less time in that engine. They're falling apart just to get, like maybe to try to get up to 40% efficient. Like usually it's 30 something percent. So it's just desperate at this point to try and save the combustion industry when it makes no sense. So, and the big one, of course, is that you can fill up your electric car battery with renewable electricity if you've got solar panels, if you've got a lot of wind turbines in your country, like we do in the UK. They're producing 50% of our power sometimes, even 60% if it's windy, and we're just building more and more and more of them. So as time goes on, more and more solar and wind is going to be available for these cars, and the environmental impact of making the electricity is going down all the time. And there's this thing called life cycle analysis, right? So you can have this point that actually EVs are more polluting in their manufacture because you've got to make a battery as well as all the car stuff, which is the same between the two. So true. And so you can go on this is from the IEA website. You can put in whatever figures you want here for different types of car, and it will tell you at which point you get the switch over in terms of the emissions difference between the battery electric car, which starts out higher because you have to make a battery for it, but you're not combusting nearly as much. Obviously, the electricity where you are in the world might use more or less combustion. If you're in a coal-powered country, then it will take you longer to get to this inflection point where the EV is lower emission than the combustion car. But you'll see for this one on their standard figures that they've got, it takes about a year and a half before the EV is in the lead, and it's only going to get better, right? As there's more and more renewable power available. So people are just talking absolute nonsense on this. It's just kind of unbelievable how wrong people are when it comes to this one. But we might say, hang on a minute, that was just about emissions, and that is something that's important to bear in mind. So there are other forms of pollution as well as emissions, and making the battery is obviously contributing to those as well. But also, people will point out that EVs are generally heavier because the battery is heavier than the fuel tank. And so we might think that that increases pollution as well. It doesn't in terms of moving it around because the EV is so much more efficient than the combustion car. It's almost like the heavier it is, the more efficiency you get out of it, weirdly. In general, it would be nicer if they were, lighter, as long as they were safe and so on, because then they're using less energy generally and therefore creating less pollution. But yeah, people have tried to point out that there's one way that being heavier might make a car more polluting, and that's that if it's heavier, it will produce more brake dust in order to make it stop, which would be true if EVs didn't have regenerative braking. So I barely ever use the brake on our EV. You only use it when the battery's full, and so you can't use the regenerative braking because there's no battery capacity to absorb the slowing down. So that's about the only time I use it, or in an emergency, right? If you suddenly need to stop, then the brakes will come on, obviously. But that's pretty rare. In fact, the problem with EVs is that the brakes go rusty because you just don't use them. But one where EVs do actually probably do worse, this one type of pollution that people are going to desperately kind of talk about is tire pollution, because EVs are heavier. So as the tire rolls along the road, obviously they wear out, and that's because the tires are being worn down by that friction and that process and so on. So that is true. That one I would say is an issue. As your car is driving down the road, maybe a little bit of the tire, kind of gets left behind on the road. Sometimes people act like this is air pollution, but it's mostly sort of on the road. And so maybe when it rains, it will get washed away. So it is still pollution. Some of it goes in the air, some of it will go into the water course. That's not very good, for the local streams and so on. Yeah, so reason to get a bicycle, right? Or something like that. Or to walk or use public transport. The difference in terms of the EV versus the ICE car is very minimal, whereas all those other pollution, it's just a complete win for the electric vehicle. But yeah, I mentioned as well the manufacturing pollution. It's more manufacturing to make the battery for the EV. That's minerals that have to be, taken to the battery plant and then, put into the car and transported around the place and so on. So, mining is bad for the environment generally. I think that what some people just completely put out of their mind is the fact that fossil fuels are mined as well. They're being dug out of the ground in huge, unimaginable quantities, shipped around the world, refined, processed, and then they're burned just once. Whereas a battery gets used thousands of times. So people are just blind to what's common, aren't they? So I think this must be it. They just forget about all of the mining that goes on with fossil fuels. But batteries are, they're rechargeable batteries we're talking. These aren't those 1980s Duracell batteries or whatever other brands are available that you put into your boom box and then it only lasts an hour. I'll talk more about batteries in a bit, but the next one, number three, was they set on fire, don't they? People just they think they're hilarious. They didn't include there's this one oh milk floats or something like that. It's just I don't know why people think that that's funny. It's what the humor is there. But yeah, this all these people putting fire emojis and saying, "Oh, it's going to explode" or something like that. Very ridiculous. It almost could have been number one, this one, except there's more ridiculous ones than this. But the question is just, is this true? And I guess the thinking maybe is that people have maybe heard about or seen lithium battery fires, right? These are really bad if you've seen them. Once they really get going, you just basically can't put them out. But fortunately, it just virtually never happens for EVs. So, sometimes there might be an electrical problem when a car's plugged in or something like that. That's happened a few times and it's, burned down outside someone's house with no one getting hurt. When you look at the statistics, EVs are just much less likely to have fires. If you have an accident, obviously there's a chance that the battery will then, set on fire. But ICE cars are full of flammable liquid, so they go on fire too in accidents, and they're more common to have the fires for combustion vehicles. It's got combustion in the name. And just think to yourself, I mean, you look up the statistics, they're out there. Fire experts have tried to work all these things out. They've found no evidence. But just think about it. Have you ever seen an EV on fire? Just any story about a car on fire, and then people lie and say this was an EV, and it wasn't. And sometimes as well, when EVs are on fire, the battery doesn't actually get on fire. The car around it will, have a fire, the battery won't. And it's the battery fires that we're worried about here. So these kind of catastrophic battery fires, they virtually never happen. But people act like it's happening every day outside every, EV owner's house. It just explodes for no reason or something like that. And I think the reason it's so rare is because batteries have battery management systems. And, the more kind of expensive, the bigger the battery, the better the battery management system you're probably going to need. And ones in EVs now, they're really well designed, very clever things that are going to try and avoid anything bad happening to this battery, especially that it would set on fire. And so these kind of high quality systems are doing their job. And then I think sometimes people get these statistics where it looks like there's more battery fires from electric vehicles. And what they're doing is they're adding in bikes. And so people are buying these kind of cheap batteries. You can even get people making them themselves out of old batteries and stuff like that, fitting them to bikes and then sort of charging them up in their house or something like that, and then they set fire and cause a terrible fire within a house. That's obviously very bad if it's in someone's house. You know, people could get hurt. Maybe if you put some of these really bad batteries into the statistics, then it comes out there's more electric vehicle fires, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about cars versus combustion cars. Number two, most ridiculous. Again, you know, I keep changing the order of the, but this is number two. Oh, you'll need to replace the battery. You know, people kind of come out with this. They seem to have this idea that it's kind of like one of those old batteries where you have to take it out and put in a new one or something like that. It's just ridiculous. And so, yeah, people saying the battery doesn't last or something like that. Where did this come from? This idea that the battery doesn't last. So maybe people are kind of manipulating statistics on this or something. In the early days of EVs, I think that there were, you know, a surprising number of them got battery replacements, and so maybe people looked at some of these early stats and said, "Oh, well, obviously the batteries don't last very long." What car companies did to reassure people was they put really long warranties on EV batteries. So usually it's something like 8 years, maybe even up to 10 years. If anything, you know, if your battery goes bad, you will get a new one. So, you know, what's the problem? I guess if it's out of the warranty, you think, oh, it's just going to fail straight away. But that's not really how warranties work. If your fridge has a 2 year warranty, then you don't think, oh, it's just going to stop after 2 years and one day. Obviously, that's the worry that it will, but you know, you would hope it would last a lot longer than that. And I think that some of those early batteries, you know, it was the early days. They hadn't learned much about these things. Maybe they had poor manufacturing processes at the time. They particularly had poor temperature management. So this is a big issue for Nissan Leafs, especially. They just let them get hot. You know, modern cars, EVs, they've got kind of liquid cooling running through them, so the batteries don't get too hot, and you can keep them at that good temperature that batteries like to be at, particularly when they're charging and discharging. The battery management system is going to make sure that it's all at a good temperature and it's all working well. So yeah, I don't think there's too much to worry about with the battery longevity on these things. But yeah, it's true in a way. Like a lot of these things, there's like a little bit in there that's kind of like there was something half true or relevant, and then it's just been exploded up. And sorry for the word, it's been sort of built up into a massive thing when it isn't at all. And of course, batteries do degrade. If you've got a rechargeable battery, then the more and more you recharge it, you know, you get slightly less each time, maybe. And so batteries don't last forever, right? So I'm not going to claim a battery is going to last forever. It's not the claim here. Batteries do degrade, and this is something that happens over time. You know, a battery just gets older and it degrades over time. But also, every time you charge it, as I say, each charge cycle is putting pressure on the battery and might reduce its lifespan. So a battery that gets used twice as much won't last as long, other things being equal. Although weirdly, sometimes EVs that have been charged a lot have actually lasted quite well, and some that haven't been charged much haven't. So there's slight complications here, and maybe using them a lot can sometimes be helpful. So it's not a simple rule, but in general, you would have an expected number of charge cycles for a particular kind of battery. So as new kind of batteries have come out, they've got more and more charge cycles compared to the older ones. So that's one factor. If you're trying to come up with a good battery, you've got a lot of things to think about. You don't want it to weigh too much because then your car would get really heavy. All these different things, you know, so they're trying to find the right kind of battery for the car. But one factor is how many charge cycles you get. And when you buy a car, you don't know how many charge cycles you're going to get for sure, right? So it's a variety, but there's a certain, you know, there's an average within that. And sort of, you know, if you're lucky, you'll get a lot more. If you're unlucky, you'll get a bit less. If you treat the battery badly, you'll get less if you kind of look after it. And mostly the BMS does that for you. It tries to stop it from being put into a situation where it's getting too hot or anything like that. Very common type of battery, I think maybe particularly in the US and in early EVs, was what they call in some places a ternary battery or a nickel manganese cobalt battery, an MC. And that would be expected to do 1,500 cycles of that battery, all the way from kind of nearly empty to pretty much full. So you could do that 1,500 times. And most of them will do more than that, or yeah, half of them will, something like that. I'm just taking a rough average here. Our car has got a lithium iron phosphate battery, that's LFP or Life PO4 is the chemical symbol for it. And that would be expected to do 3,000 cycles on average, but many will do thousands more than that. Some of them have done 10,000 cycles. So this kind of battery is actually cheaper. It's very straightforward. It's slightly heavier, so it adds to the weight of your car, but it's increasingly being used because it's so cheap and it lasts so well. And we'll see, there's new batteries coming out all the time, new battery chemistries, and maybe one of these new ones that are being worked on will be an improvement as well. So what I encourage people to do is to just try and work this out for themselves, right? You look at the range of your vehicle, what in average use you would expect to get as the range of your vehicle, and then multiply that by this number of charge cycles. And that is the expected mileage that you would get from a battery electric vehicle. So, maybe if you're lucky, if you look after your battery, you'll get a lot more than this. Maybe if you mistreat the battery, you kind of fill it up or leave it empty and just leave it to sit there for months and months and months, full or empty, then that's bad for the battery. But otherwise, if you leave it in the middle sort of range of the battery, you can leave it for a while, and it's fine with a lithium battery to do that. And I did the calculation for our car. If we assume 200 miles of range, I think the official mileage is 218 or something. So 200 times 3,000, which is your expected number of cycles for a lithium phosphate battery, I calculate that as 600,000 miles. And we do about 7 or 8,000 miles a year, I think. So this car is not going to last that long. It's going to fall apart before this. Battery would be put into another car, maybe, or it could be, used for something else. We've got trees, to run our house off as well, so it could be used for that. Who knows what will end up happening to our battery after the car's worn out? We'll just have to see. I'm not at all worried about needing a replacement battery. Basically, it's a joke. It can do many more miles than we're putting the car through. And that leads us to the kind of my number one most ridiculous argument that I now see from people who are just desperate. For some reason, they're desperate to attack EVs like it's something that is really bad for them. And so they need to come up with some sort of reason why it's a terrible, terrible idea. And that everyone should stick to combustion vehicles. And the latest one is just really funny. It's that they've got no soul. Electric vehicle doesn't have soul. What does this mean? What on earth are people thinking with this one? I boggles my mind, to be honest. Like, I don't know if, people have got confused or something, or they kind of think, if something's got a clanking engine, then that gives it soul. I don't know. Maybe they mean something by it. Maybe those old steam engines have got more soul. One of these fairly quiet kind of petrol cars that you get now, or gasoline cars. So maybe traction engines, you see them sometimes like at events as well around the UK, and they make a lot of noise and don't produce much power, and people might say, oh, they've got a lot of soul or something like that. Is that what people mean? I don't know. But yeah, I worry that, people have got confused and they think that, Herbie was real. Sorry, 50-year-old man. Herbie was just a film character. It's just a car with someone pretending that they're not driving it when they are. Or maybe they've seen that film Cars. I haven't actually seen it, but I think there's you know, the characters are cars and they drive themselves around and they're like people, but they're cars or something like that. So that's not real. These things aren't real. And I just can't help but think if someone says EVs don't have soul, I want my vehicle to have soul. Get a horse, right? These things have got loads of soul. Look at those eyes. Some of them got like eyelashes and things like that. So yeah, if you want to have transport with soul, then go for this. If you want a vehicle that's gonna be, fit for the future, then just get an electric vehicle. They're the way to go. So ridiculous arguments against EVs. It's a real shame that I've had to make this video, but yeah, some people seem to take EVs as a kind of like a personal insult against themselves, and they have to come up with some sort of reason to justify themselves or something like that. So I think that there are some better arguments against EVs. Maybe at the moment they're not for everyone. I think that they're fine for the vast majority of people, but maybe there's a certain like use case that people will try and say, oh, well, I need to drive a car this many miles and, with a trailer and I've got to take my horse or something like that. So maybe for them, an EV isn't quite right and they need a car with an engine. But yeah, some of the better arguments that I'd have a bit more time for, the charging infrastructure isn't ready. So yeah, this takes time to build this stuff. And the problem is obviously it has to increase in proportion to the number of EVs. So sometimes the number of EVs will get ahead of the kind of the charging infrastructure. Sometimes the charging infrastructure will be ahead, but they both need to increase at the same time. There's no point building all the charging infrastructure if there's no cars to use them. So they have to kind of go up together. But charging infrastructure, this has really not been an issue for us. We charge our car at home. We've only had to use chargers away from home, on the road twice. Once on the way to a holiday cottage, we had a charger, so we charged it up there. And then once on the way back, on the way there, we stopped off at a supermarket and did our shopping. On the way back, I mean, both journeys, we actually just walked the dog during that time as well. But yeah, we haven't actually spent any time charging, really, if you exclude the shopping and things like that. Yeah, but sometimes, if you're doing a long journey, you might need to charge the car. You need there to be a charger available. And all I would say was, the more people that have EVs, the more incentive there is to put in charging points because a company is going to want to attract customers. If there's loads of EVs out there, then people are going to think, oh, we need to have EV chargers on our site to attract people because otherwise they'll go somewhere else where there is an EV charger. So that's the way it's going to work. But as well, environmentalists have great arguments against EVs, right? Because on environmental grounds, no car at all is better for the environment than an EV, right? So having a bicycle instead, having no car at all, and then, maybe a few times a year you need to hire one. Or there's car shares in big cities. Often there will be some kind of car club or a company that you can hire a car from. And, public transport is obviously a much more environmentally friendly way to get around. You're sharing the transport with, tens of other people, maybe even hundreds of people if it's a train. Much better for the environment than everyone having their own individual car. So that one's absolutely true. And maybe as well along these kinds of lines, cars don't solve all problems because congestion is caused by cars. So EVs don't make that any better. I mean, it is a lot better if you've got a traffic jam and it's silent and the cars aren't all just sat there idling, pumping out fumes into the local environment. So a kind of congestion with EVs is kind of nicer, but it's still congestion. It doesn't solve that problem. Whereas things like public transport and active transport, walking, cycling, things like that, that does solve the problem of congestion. But as things stand in a lot of cities around the world, everything's set up where you need a car, to get to work, to do your shopping and things like that. So, yeah, they might be a necessary thing for some people, to have a car. Maybe, if you can go down from two cars to one car or something like that, that would be better for the environment. But yeah, other than that, cars do seem to be kind of necessary. But let's try and improve our cities, right? Let's try and improve the public transport. Let's try and make cities better designed so that people don't need a car to just live their life, so that there is an alternative. So yeah, so experts in cities are trying to make that possible and to make it easier for people to live without a car. But then conspiracy theorists come up with kind of crazy stuff about that. So yeah, it's just the world we live in. So yeah, so I've tried to come up with what I think are the top five most ridiculous arguments against EVs. Can you think of any that I've missed? Were there more ridiculous ones out there? So yeah, have I put them in the wrong order? Do you have any better ones that I should have put in? So yeah, do share those in the comments. If you think that someone's being ridiculous, maybe send them this video and make them realize how ridiculous they are on this topic. And thanks very much for listening.